Here we are today with Amran Bengio and Olivia SB Huntington of Wootz. They also have a third co-founder, Alex Marks, who didn't make it here today with us. But Wootz is a Texas-based advanced materials startup that manufactures carbon and nanotube super materials. These innovative materials have wide-ranging applications, particularly in the energy space, where Wootz is exploring use cases in harvesting energy, flexible solar cells, and EV motors. I'm very excited about EV motors. So tell me about the EV motors piece that you're working on.
Absolutely. So electrification in the EV space is really taxing the world's copper supply and processing capabilities. We're also living, in a geopolitical atmosphere where relations with China are maybe in a tense place, and China is responsible for processing and refining over half of the world's copper. They don't supply half of it, but they do process over half of it, and you need copper in its refined state or processed state in order to make EV motor coils. That's really the part of EV motors that we're going after, and we're looking at it from the point of view of what can we do to make copper better. And we believe that with our carbon nanotube technology, if properly alloyed with copper, you can have an EV motor that is lighter, has a higher ampacity, namely a higher ability to carry current. And generally, if you're displacing copper, it mitigates some of the climate impact associated with the extraction and refining of said metal.
Oh my gosh, my inner materials nerd just went off because I heard you say alloying copper, and I was thinking to myself, a nanotube is like a stringy thing, but usually copper or metals are a crystally thing. So tell me what's going on there when you mean alloying.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. There's a whole class of materials called metal matrix composites, and that's where this fits in, specifically continuous fiber reinforced metal matrix composites. A good example of a way this is done is actually also in the energy space in overhead transmission lines, where folks have taken to reinforcing aluminum with things like ceramic fiber, carbon fiber, in order to overcome some of the issues associated with running these metals at high temperatures for extended periods of time. Namely, metals, unlike carbon, when you heat them up, they expand. And so the shape that you had in mind and designed around for your conductor that it starts at suddenly is no longer the shape that it has when you're running, say, at emergency, transmission line amperage load. So that's the material subset we fit in: continuous fiber reinforced metal matrix composites.
Alloying.
Kind of a mouthful, but yeah.
Alloying is a lot easier to say, so I get that.
Continuous fiber reinforced
metal matrix
composites. All right. So Jason's inner materials nerd is coming out, and I'm just excited to say the word Wootz, right?
People cheer for us.
Right, I know.
That's nice.
So coming from a policy world, and I am always just amazed by entrepreneurs and how you came up with this. So can you explain to me from the very ABCs, how did you guys get started? How did you get into carbon nanotubules? What's the origin? What was that like?
We're so really standing on the shoulders of giants. I mean, I did my PhD at Rice University, which has a long-standing history of developing and characterizing advanced forms of carbons. It began with Rick Smalley, with the C60 Buckminster fullerenes molecule, and Rice had some of the very first gen. They're called HIPCO reactors because there's high pressure carbon monoxide reactors for making carbon nanotubes. So I came into this space, rosy-eyed and bushy-tailed, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed.
So you just woke up and you're like, I want to be in carbon nanotubes.
No, so actually, okay, so personal twist on the story. I've always been fascinated with the world of the very small. When I was in undergrad, I was doing high energy particle physics. I worked at CERN for one summer. And then after my physics undergrad, it was sort of like I was at a crossroads, right? Wasn't sure what I wanted to do next. Ended up spending a year in Israel working in a research lab for free. And it was just happenstance that lab was doing electron microscopy analysis of carbon nanotubes that came from Rice. And when I was tasked with doing some of that imaging, I look at this stuff and I was like, hang on, this is actually carbon? Like this stuff which conducts electricity like a metal, that handles like a textile fiber, that is lightweight, chemically resistant, that is just carbon, right? And it was like, pinch me, please, because I can't believe that I'm awake. And that really was the impetus, just seeing the material under a microscope at the nanoscale, but then also being able to touch it, to feel it, to see the macroscopic properties. I was like, I got to help advance this however I can.
I love it.
Went back to Rice for the PhD. Yeah.
How did your team? How did you call the Avengers together? How did you get started?
So after the PhD, I did admittedly become a little bit disillusioned in academia, just because there's a lot of hurdles that you have to overcome, which the academic mindset, where you're trying to do innovation in the scientific sense, not in the commercially enabling sense. And that is a hugely different perspective to take. So once I reached the end of my PhD, I figured the best way to get this out into the real world was to start a company. And I knew that I needed perspectives very, very different from my own. So I approached a friend of mine, undergrad, who we were roommates through undergrad, who was a mechanical engineer, and by that point had spent 8 years working out in industry as a senior manufacturing engineer. That would be Alex Marks, along with the third co-founder, Justin, who Alex says is an amazing line technician and operator at the different manufacturing companies that he worked with. That team of 3 got started, and Olivia joined us. I'll let Olivia speak to as to what drew her to Wootz, actually.
I think it's that I've always been fascinated by the space of deep tech space in general. I think I'm an engineer at heart, and I just missed my calling early on. And by that point, I was a lawyer. I'd put too much time and money into my career, and I couldn't really imagine going back and starting from scratch. But I did know that I had the skill set to take genius and bring it out into the real world. So take it out of the lab and bring it into the real world and make it available to humanity at large. And I think that all of us are first principle builders in our own way. And we each come to Wootz because we want something out of this business, out of our material. So we want it to be widely distributed. We want it to be used. We want to be able to pick up a product off a shelf or drive a car that incorporates our materials and know that we have made our mark in the world and that we have left the world a better place when we're done. And I think that's really important to all of us from our own, individual perspectives.
Oh, I have such a trick question to ask you now. Like, were you getting that in your prior career as a lawyer? And are you still lawyering now in your new role?
Oh, those are tough questions here. Just put me on the spot a little bit. I would say that by and large, as an M&A attorney in the deep tech space, I was. I mean, I was helping my clients bring their products to market, grow their business, make their exits. But I was ancillary, right? I would kind of parachute in. I'd help them with a particular project or a particular transaction, and then I'd be gone and I'd watch them from afar. And I think that I was really, over time, I wanted to be in it. I wanted to be in the day-to-day grind. I wanted to have a small team that was aligned and focused and passionate and motivated. And that's really hard to do when you're parachuting in and out of these deals constantly. So I think it took me about 2 years to start to feel that, think about it, evaluate the risks, and come to terms with the fact that I was going to lose most of my income for a while. And then I made the jump to Wootz.
It's a big jump.
So I want to go back to what you talked about when you were a researching, right? You're so kind of in the university setting, and that you had a choice. Like, do you continue the more academic route or do you commercialize? And to me, this is really interesting. If you think about Texas, we have amazing research institutions. So much money is coming to our schools.
Yep.
I'm pointing at you, University of Texas, Texas A&M, which I think is it often the largest university in the country. You've got U of H, you've got Rice, more and more and more. But then you look at the number of climate tech, energy transition startups coming straight out of university. It's not that many compared to the size because it's hard, right? And it's a challenge for universities everywhere. It's a challenge for students. I'm interested how we can try to accelerate that whole process. What was it like for you? What was challenging and what did you find? Like, how did you decide? I do want to break out.
That's a very It's a very good question. I would say that the hardest part is changing from your parameters for success are completely different, right? Whereas previously in academia, everyone who's built their career and a successful career in academia knows it's about publishing, right? It's the paper publication race. That is your metric for success. The higher impact factor journal, the better, right? Mm-hmm. And to get those papers, you need to have results and methods that stand out above the rest. Whether those methods are actually commercially enabling or scalable is not within the purview of an academic paper. It is a bonus for sure, and authors will make a point to highlight scalability when they publish, but you can still get, in a tier 1 journal like Science or Nature with something that relies on, days or even weeks of ultracentrifugation, right, mm-hmm. as a process step, for example. So because a lot of people who built their career in academia do not have necessarily industry background, at least that's not, there are exceptions, right? But that's not the rule usually. We don't have that perspective when we're in academia to radically rethink about how to make a process scalable. And that's because people who are, doing mechanical engineering or manufacturing are not in academia. I think one of the big issues that we need to have more applied research institutes where both industries and academia come to work on common topics, because it can't be done just in industry. At least it is being done, but obviously, we're talking about taking innovation from academia, and it does start in the lab, right, into industry. There needs to be a halfway point, right? We definitely would have loved to have such a halfway point between the academia and the startup that we're in now, because you need the industrial and scalability perspective.
I think this is my favorite part of joining a startup, honestly, is to watch Amram and Alex feed off of each other. Mm-hmm. The whole is greater than its parts with them. And it's like I get to watch it live, like in real time, as they're sitting and they're talking back and forth, and Alex is coming with his perspective and Amram's coming with his perspective. And I'm just watching this kind of idea grow. And it's a beautiful thing. And I think that while obviously we are not engaged in research, a la academic research, right? We are constantly in a state of R&D. Mm-hmm. And I don't really see this changing over the future because, we are just scratching the surface of what is possible with carbon nanotubes in light of our process. And there is so much more there for us to explore and so many other benefits that we can bring to bear. And a lot of that comes from this kind of spark of creativity that you get when you put different people in a room together.
So let's talk about you're going to say something?
Just a huge thank you for the shout out.
So let's talk about the technology for a little bit. So it's carbon nanotubes, but I assume all carbon nanotubes are not created equal, and that is kind of the root of your technology.
That is very, very correct. To give you a sense of just how broad the spectrum is, you can look at carbon nanotube price points per kilogram in the market today and go all the way down to maybe $100 per kilogram, and all the way up to $80,000 per kilogram.
Sorry, that's a big number.
That is a big number, right? And it's heart stopping.
And that's not even accounting for the crazier, even more niche, like chirality type purified carbon nanotubes. So nanotubes come in all different shapes and sizes. I just touched on price point, but you actually have a lot of different kinds of carbon nanotubes beyond just how many walls they have. Right, you have single wall, double wall, triple wall, and beyond that, we just call them multi-wall. You also have 2/3 of them are semiconductors, and about 1/3 are metallic.
They also come from different sources as well, which really we are really leveraging that to up our climate impact here, because you can have carbon nanotubes from non-sustainable sources such as oil, but you can also have them from biochar and methane, derived carbon nanotubes through different processes. And these are becoming more and more available in the United States as research out of the national labs pushes this forward. And we're really excited to see the possibilities that open in the next couple of years for us to really be using sustainably sourced carbon nanotubes in our process.
All right, so I'm going to unpack a few things. So when I think carbon nanotubes, and this is a terrible thought, I think of carbon spaghetti. But what you're describing for me is not that. Like, there's actually a whole class of materials here. You were talking about how they're single and double walled. So I'm assuming there's a structure that actually makes a tube, right? Like it's got an inside and an outside. It's got a thickness.
Yeah.
And then I also and so there's a diameter to it, I guess, that's more than an atom thick. Like, we're talking about real dimensionality here. But we're also talking about that there are different materials within the carbon, right? So it sounds like there's some doping that's involved where you can make it metallic or make it more like a semiconductor. Is that where that comes from? Or?
No, it's still all carbon.
Oh,
it has to do with, so if you think of the tubular structure is absolutely right.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you think of, unzip the carbon nanotube in your mind and put it on a 2D surface, it would be a sheet of graphene, right? Now, if you take that sheet of graphene and you bring it together into a tube, you can do that a number of different ways. Like if I take a piece of paper here, you can wrap it corner to corner like that, or you can add a little bit of twist to it as you wrap it. That by itself, with all the atoms still just being carbon, is responsible for that wide variety of electrical and electro-optical properties, really, in the carbon nanotubes.
That's magic. That's pretty
right?
cool.
It is magic. It is absolutely magic. And then we are able to tweak it a little bit as it goes through our process. So we're able to kind of oomph up some of its properties as a result of the nature of the process through which we put, the raw carbon nanotubes to get them into a lined, densely packed, circular, form.
Yeah, that tube structure. And so a lot of the differentiation is the quality or the repeatability of the tubes you manufacture, because you're not making one. You're making, I imagine, millions at a time.
We're actually not making the carbon nanotubes ourselves.
Okay.
We buy carbon nanotubes from suppliers. And so we buy them, again, we probe that entire, spectrum of the market that I mentioned. Yes, even sometimes going up to some of those $10,000 a kilogram type tubes, because they do have a part to play, even in small quantities, to make something that is still commercially viable. Some niche applications do require that level of performance.
Yeah, what really sets us apart from others in this space is that because we purify our materials before they ever go into our process, we're able to buy carbon nanotubes from across the spectrum, and then we create tailored custom blends. So if you are thinking of a particular application and you're really looking for certain properties, right? Our properties, you can almost think of them as being tunable. So you can dial them up or dial them down depending on the composition of the blend of carbon nanotubes that we start with. And this is really what sets us apart. And it's also what allows us to, incorporate more sustainably sourced carbon nanotubes over time, rather than having to do it, we can do it stepwise as opposed to from one day having nothing and the next day having 100%.
So can you talk me through your business model then? Like, what would your ideal customer be that you are purifying and tweaking the product to provide them? How does that interaction work?
Yeah, there's two fronts, really. I mean, on the one hand, we provide coating services where, because we're processing carbon nanotubes in a fluid state, we're able to take substrates or even, materials and devices from a partner and coat it with carbon nanotubes, right? With some modifications to make sure there's material compatibility. In another scenario, another part of the model, it's literally just, sales. I mean, we sell carbon nanotube tape, carbon nanotube fibers. There's these different product forms with some post-processing on top of it that is application specific usually. And that's really one of the first big hurdles that we faced was, okay, people almost always want our material for use in an electrical application, right? Something that requires electrical conductivity. How do you interface between decades of modern circuitry design based on metals and this carbon-based material? A little bit of material science, metals do not wet carbon. There
Mhm.
is no mechanism for chemical bond formation unless you form what's known as a metal carbide. At that point, you can create a bond between the two, but that comes at the cost of a much higher resistance. Metal carbides are usually a lot less conducting than the pure form of the metal. And so that was one of the first big problems we faced, right? It was like, can we provide a turnkey solution for all of our partners across all these different industries for how to interface between carbon nanotubes and metal circuitry components?
So to I guess go a little bit higher level, right, for the non-technically minded folks in the audience,
Sorry.
right, myself included, and Laura, I see you over there. So we our business is a manufacturing model, but it's really customer-focused optionality, right? So what our customers want is what we aim to provide them with, and those wants are going to change over time, and our process allows for that. So when Amram, first approached me, and I was, outside counsel for Wootz, and he was trying to explain this very complicated process to me, the way that I was able to kind of like simplify it and internalize it was, if you do not have proper physical conditioning, you are never going to be a great athlete, right? It's a necessary component, and our first purification step is our physical conditioning. It's what takes these raw carbon nanotubes and puts them into a form that is usable in our process, right? And then we put them into a fluid phase, which is just a fancy way of saying that we convert them into fluids. So when Amram was talking about the coatings, we call those our inks, right? And if I were to give you a vial of them, they would look like ink out of a pen. You wouldn't be able to distinguish it. And they behave as inks as well. So that's how we are able to coat using a number of different processes. And then on the higher concentration end, we call those our spin dopes. And those are what we use to extrude our fibers. And up until, like, once you have those vials of fluid, right, the rest of the process is standard industrial manufacturing process for coatings and fiber extrusion, right? So all the magic happens in the first part, in the purification and the formation of these fluids. And the rest of it is standard. And the reason that is so beneficial to us is that it allows us to interface with our partners' existing manufacturing setups, right? So they don't really have to tweak their lines. They don't have to tweak their processes to incorporate our materials. And then on top of that, as Amram was saying, we have spent a lot of time trying to make this a turnkey solution to drive adoption, right? And a new material, people need to want to use this material. And the easier it is to integrate it into their products, the more likely they are to adopt it. And so we have spent quite a lot of time going back to the R&D aspect that we talked about before, of working through the complications of connecting a carbon system to modern industrial circuitry.
I'm thinking, and I'm hearing that there's a lot of tailoring to the customer need, and there's a part of me that wonders if material technology is always like this, or is this a more recent development that comes from your expertise? Like, kind of the question behind this is, why didn't this exist 10 years ago?
In carbon nanotubes?
Just, yeah, generally, I know very little about material sciences. So, like, when I hear this kind of tailoring, I keep thinking, oh, it's more magic. Like, you're waving a wand here.
That I can answer.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I can answer that one and then hand it off to you. So the reason that we tailor it today is to drive adoption, right? People have, it's the reason you stage a house when you go to sell a house, right? It's very hard to imagine a life inside an empty house. It is much easier to imagine a life in a staged house, right? And we're trying to do the same thing. So customers who might not intuitively know how to incorporate our material and get as much value out of our material, right? If they come to us and they say, our problem is X, and we say, here's a solution for you, right? They're much more likely to adopt it. And that necessarily involves a level of tailoring to their particular application or their particular product. But we, as a business, speaking as a business person here and wanting to make this a, something massive, ultimately we are looking to move into the wholesale market. So this tailoring is an early part of our business model. Whether it will stay the main feature of our business model is really up, who knows at this point.
I would say it'll always be a feature, certainly not a main feature like it is today. But, because it's early days, But if you look, for example, at the plastics industry, everyone talks about polymer master batches, right? They always have different grades of the same molecule, right? If it's polyethylene, you've got low molecular weight, high molecular weight, and that confers different properties to the products that are made from it. So that tailoring will probably always be a feature, but to the extent that we are doing it today, probably not. Right now, it's really because, who is out there using carbon nanotube macro materials, right? Not a whole lot of people. And so getting industry familiar with it. Here's a very good example. We tout flexibility as a huge boon, right? As a cool property, because when you handle the fiber, it feels like a thread, right? Okay, all conductors that we use today are mostly rigid. Sure, copper is soft and bendable, but it's not like a textile, right? So now you have to show the customer how to adapt their system, which was designed around rigid wires, right? Or maybe slightly bendable, ductile copper wires, and adapt that to work with something that handles more like a textile. From a technical standpoint, you're definitely thinking it's an advantage. From a commercialization standpoint, it's just that much further from what the customer is used to.
Okay. And so from an innovation academic perspective, it's a reflection of like where the market development is, right? Like you guys are seeing that the market has moved from like the super early adopters to kind of this early adopter phase where people are saying, yeah, I think there's value. You got to show me how this works. But you see kind of on the horizon that you're going to hit an early majority like within the life cycle of Wootz. And so you're kind of training the market, you're educating them, and that's kind of the unfair advantage that'll let you win in the marketplace. But what really opens the door is when people say, okay, I know how to deal with this now. This stuff's awesome. And I want it in everything.
Exactly.
Well, we would call it a fair advantage, right? We spend a lot of time and effort to develop something that is useful and valuable to our customers. But I think you're exactly right. And that really, we've really seen this there are certain industries where we know that our materials could add very significant value, but that industry is incredibly risk adverse, and they are just never going to be first adopters, no matter how amazing this material could make their product. It's just never going to happen. And so what's been quite interesting from my perspective is to, over time, identify the markets that are less risk adverse and are more willing to adopt new materials or take a risk on a new material. And they're sometimes quite surprising. For example, one that absolutely, you could have knocked me over with a feather is I would have assumed that rail and railways would be quite conservative, would be a quite conservative industry. And that has turned out to not really be true. So we're constantly learning about the market, about the demand, and about the risk tolerance of our hopeful customers, right? Potential customers.
And that's what you just described. I think you could use the exact same comparison for the energy transition and like all industry, right? And we have solutions, we have great solutions, and you've got the first adopters and the folks that are just very out there making commitments, trying to do everything. And then you've got the folks that are saying, you guys go learn and test every single thing. And once it is perfectly normal, then we'll get into the game. But then you throw the urgency of climate, of the energy transition, of what we're trying to do into the mix. And so it is really interesting to see who the players are who come forward, who are willing to try things. And that a lot of times it's not necessarily at all about climate. It's about another problem that they have. And they're really looking for a creative solution that they're not finding anywhere. And so that's where the kind of climate tech innovation ecosystem is so cool to me, because you're solving multiple problems at once, right? It's not just one thing. And I feel like you guys kind of have that similar story of you were over here and like you're finding how all of the things, all of the opportunities can come together, and just who's going to be the first to push it forward.
I also think that we have found a very happy home in this space, because the urgency drives capital, and that capital is slightly more patient. And the stuff that we're doing is complicated, it's complex, it's new, it's innovative, it hasn't been done before, and that means that it takes time, right? And for our materials to really be out there and be widely adopted, we need to be producing them on pretty significant scales. And that takes a lot of time and energy and effort to stand up. You can't do that overnight, right? And so we are quite thankful that in this space, more and more, we're seeing that the capital is patient over 5 to 7 to 10-year time horizons in a way that there just wasn't as much of that capital in the ecosystem 5 years ago.
Yeah, and that's one thing Houston likes, is thinking about how do we take this thing and make it big and do big processes. And so I can see how the patient capital is also waiting for you guys. And then when it's time to make that $1 billion factory, they'll be like, here you go. Show us how it's done.
But we need it earlier.
Yeah.
I think that's the critical, because you were talking about the eco space here in Houston, and at the when we're talking really small quantities of money, we're talking seed money, under 2 million. That space is quite active, we've seen. And then, just as you mentioned, Jason, like as soon as you're talking, industrial scale, everyone's there to put their money, and at that point, you kind of have revenue. So you have the combination of income sources at that point. It's the time period in between that's a little difficult, because you're really making that jump from lab scale or prototype or really concept to pilot to setting up a line to getting spools, in our case, of our material off of our pilot line. And that A to B series space, I think, is where, if I were to have a wish list, right, I would wish that maybe the capital here in Houston were a little bit more focused on enabling that jump, so that you had more startups that could actually scale to meet demand.
And I think that's something that we see a lot, and that it is especially difficult in energy and climate tech, because what you're doing is really capital intensive, even in the early stages. And that the capital that we have here is looking for really large projects that they can take global. And who's going to be doing the educating, right? Is it your job? Who should be stepping in? And then you can also say, well, should we be outsourcing? Should Houston be doing more to bring other folks into Houston to look at our technologies? And I think it's a bit all of the above, right?
You were going to say something?
No, go ahead, Jason.
So, you made a decision when you started the company to stay in Houston, as opposed to going places where maybe the Series A capital might be, more available. But what made you stay in Houston?
To be honest, Jason, I don't think that I knew how to spell Series A when I started the company.
That's a good answer.
If I could stand up here today and tell you that I had that level of foresight when I started the startup, I'd be lying.
Yeah.
But no, so really what made me stay, and Alex and Justin both agreed, is that Houston is not like Silicon Valley in the sense that there is way more hard manufacturing out here. People here are companies here and facilities. Look at the amount of machine shops that there are, right? This is about actually building industrial equipment. This is a place where industrial manufacturing is, high on the list, primarily because of energy, right? I mean, I still remember when I was in high school in a French high school, and I told people I'm going to Rice for undergrad. Where's Rice? Houston, Texas. Oh, what? You're going to be a cowboy or something? Was what I heard. It's like, no, okay, listen, like there's like NASA, the largest med center in the world. It's energy capital of the world, right? But these are all, again, it's not software. This is a lot of hard tech. And that supporting infrastructure, and more than anything, supporting services, is a huge boon. Additionally, I think that if we were trying to stand up a pilot facility that uses the kind of solvents we are using and carbon nanotubes in California, it would have taken us a little bit longer.
That being said, though, our capital is not from Texas.
True.
So, it comes from the coasts. It comes from abroad. And I think that's the rub.
That's part of that. Like, I think our ecosystem isn't fully baked yet, right? But then also, why, given the Zoomification of everything during the pandemic, should it be so geographically focused? Like, we keep going back to that because ecosystems at the end of the day are tied to a place, but capital isn't, right?
It isn't, but if you think about investing in an early stage startup, right? You're investing in the tech, but by and large, you're investing in the team. And there is something to be said for having your capital in a location that allows you to interact with them frequently and over time, right? Because then they get to know you, they get to know your team dynamics, and it can instill that confidence in them that is harder to instill over Zoom. I'm not going to lie, right? And I think that would be great for us, you know?
I always found it surprising how much my angel investors would like to pop in and visit.
Yes.
And I think that is a significant part of their decision is, can I drive and see you?
Yeah,
we tell them we have dangerous chemicals on site.
Yeah, they don't want to come and visit us. But you know, we have a physical manufacturing presence. Like, one of the things that we do frequently for our prospective investors is to give them a quote unquote tour of our facility. But it's not the same. It's not real. You can't touch it. You can't see it with your own eyes. There's a level of distance that's imposed by it through the virtual setup that is hard to overcome.
Yeah, people who drive out to make the drive to come out and see us, because we are about located an hour north of Houston, usually always walk away being like, wow, I can't believe this is like out in the country. Like, this is really, we're out in Cleveland, Texas. But I think that's really one of the strengths, this state. Like, we were able to just get our commercial building license stood up in no time, get registered with, TCEQ for hazardous waste disposal in no time, right? Not going to speak to the right or wrong of this approach versus California. I'm just going to say, from our standpoint, this was really, really, it could have been a lot harder. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, when you're cast strapped, it does help.
Yeah.
So this exact your California comparison came up in a conversation yesterday, and I was trying to show both sides. Like, there are two sides of this coin, right? There are lots of cons to some of Texas's regulatory or lack thereof mechanisms. And that has led to a history of certain industries being able to grow really quickly. And there's good and bad with that. But the flip side also is that you are seeing new industries being able to grow really quickly here. And it just comes down to me to this like disconnect in people's heads about what Houston is, about what's going on here, right? Like, they probably have not heard of Cleveland, Texas, many people. And how to get the capital that we have here into a more early stage, right? Lots of private equity, lots of folks who have been in traditional energy, and it looks and feels different and it acts different. Or how do you convince the folks that are in the Bay Area, that are in Silicon Valley, that are in New York, like, come to Houston? Like, should we have a road show? Should we be bringing people here? Like, the rodeo is coming up soon. It's a lovely time of year. Like, to get them to say, hey, I want to come down and see all of these things, because think that might open some doors as well.
Absolutely. And as long as we don't bring them here during the summer months,
right?
Right. Rodeo is a great time for it. Who doesn't love mutton busting?
Oh.
Exactly.
And when they even learn what mutton busting is,
Exactly.
mind
blown. One of you must describe what mutton busting is for those of us. This is the hidden gem of Houston.
It really
right?
is.
So
it really
please
is.
Describe.
I look forward to it every year. Take toddlers, young kids, strap them to a sheep, right? And then just send the sheep off into the arena, kicking and screaming. Well, they don't scream, right?
They bay.
Bleeding.
Yeah, bleeding.
Yeah. And
bleeding, not bleeding.
Yeah, exactly.
I know. They're like in there like little ticks. They're like just
hold
like
for their
held
lives.
on to the
Yeah.
back of these sheep. I love it so much.
They can get kicked off pretty harshly.
And they're so proud when they win.
Oh,
it's just, it just makes your heart proud. It makes my heart explode.
They do get helmets.
Yes,
they do.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
Helmet.
Clarification.
Right.
That is it's amazing how many of those I can watch and it won't ever get old.
Oh yeah. Every
so
time.
Would recommend for sure.
Okay, so another question. You talked about deep tech, tough tech, said climate tech, carbon tech. What do you guys consider yourselves, and how does carbon play into conversation with things like the IRA, with when we talk about not just like emissions reduction, but we're going to capture all of this carbon. A lot of focus is what can we do creatively with carbon?
Mm-hmm. So I mean, correct me if you disagree with this, but I would say that we think of ourselves as being in deep tech, predominantly because of the time horizons around our scale up, and the fact that our materials are frontier breaking, right? So I think that's how we think of ourselves, with an overlay of climate. It's very important to us as a team on a personal level. So whether or not we consider ourselves part of climate tech, we look at everything through a climate lens for sure.
Carbon, yeah, I mean, deep tech for sure, because of, the nature of what we're doing, but also the applications and the markets that we're going into, right? I mean, it's not, we haven't yet come up with a good, B2C model for bringing carbon nanotubes to market. I don't think we will for some time. But the other, to your point about carbon, we touched on, the sustainable aspects upstream of us, namely always keeping our ear to the ground for what we like to call sustainably sourced carbon nanotubes, either because they come from an agricultural waste stream or because they're the byproduct of, methane pyrolysis, like, carbon black turned into carbon nanotubes.
The fancy, more scientific way of explaining what I said before.
Yes.
Those are all the upstream segments, but in almost every application that we're looking at downstream of us, there is a net benefit in the forms of making a system lighter or more energy efficient, right? The EV motor coils is a very good example. Overhead transmission lines is another, right? People reinforcing it with ceramic fiber. Well, ceramic fiber is an electrical insulator. So that's great for the immediate near-term safety concern of having your line sag below the sag safety limit, but you just sacrificed a whole bunch of the cross-sectional area of your electrical conductor by adding an insulator.
And so what I'm hearing is policy is going to influence upstream the actual production of the nanotubes, but more so it'll affect how people deploy technology, and that's part of driving demand.
Yes.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that we struggle with a little bit today, not only is if we're looking at time horizons of 7 to 10 years, what is the regulatory environment in this space going to look like at that time? What are we shooting for? Because if we're designing a 21st century material, we need to future proof it, right? We should be aiming for what's going to be the standard in 20 years, not what is the standard around climate today. And I think that one of the things that we struggle with most is around how people think about carbon capture and carbon storage, because our materials are a functional form of carbon storage. When you use our material, you have carbon that is in a stored state, right? And not only that, but our materials are fully recyclable. Like you can put it back through our process with no degradation of properties, unlike plastic, which is, recyclable to a certain extent. And so I think that right now our view around carbon to value, the circular economy, carbon capture and storage is narrow and limited. And we're really excited to see an aperture in this view happen over the next couple of years, because I think it'll really let carbon-based materials shine and really highlight the value that we bring.
Yeah, if we talked about turning it into diamond, no one would bat an eye and see the value right away, right? To your point about letting it shine. Carbon nanotubes is going to be...
I liked your pun.
Yeah.
Nice one.
That was good.
Very nicely done.
Carbon, yeah, that would be like the easiest way to get the point across, right? That we can do so much with carbon. It's an incredibly, versatile atom, the backbone of, life as we know it. But it's easier to wrap your head around diamond, I think, than it is to wrap your head around carbon nanotubes. And that's where we're working to, change by showing people, letting them feel it and see what it can do in a product, in one of their, existing product lines.
Materials are really hard because policy right now is very focused on the energy that you use and really the source, a little bit more around transportation, but that really goes back to the energy and the fuel. And materials often get left out of the conversation. Same thing with like the built environment, even though those are the things that you and I interact with on a daily basis, that there's an incredible health implication of all of these things.
Mm-hmm.
But that gets into just like several layers harder of things that people understand. And I think also we tend to, and this is a Houston thing, I think, because our energy industry has been so used to developing fuels, putting them in something, a truck, a pipeline, giving them to someone else, that when we think about carbon, we kind of want it to be the same way, right? We want to put it underground. We want pipelines. We want very technical, pressurized, takes the same kind of expertise that we excel in. So then when you think about, well, what else could we do? And when, to your point, you really could do
so much
like
with carbon.
The options could be exponential, right? We've not traditionally looked into that. And so it has this kind of like new factor, not necessarily bad, but like a question mark, an unknown. And I like that because I want Houston to grab hold of that and be like, ooh, we can do this, right? It is all of the same things that we have been doing. It's just like tweaking it a little bit. But at the same time, having unlimited possibilities can be really scary and like overwhelming. And so I'm excited to see how you guys are like navigating that path of picking the things that move forward.
I mean, from your lips to our investors' ears.
But I think that speaks to part of the education, right? Like it's educating the market, but it's also in some ways educating the Houston ecosystem that there is, alternative ways to participate in the energy transition. And I think that's an important part of the work you guys are doing is, showing, pioneering and showing the leadership of energy transition doesn't just mean making a new type of fuel. I think that's what Lara is saying. That
we like taking things out of the ground and we like putting them back into the ground.
Yeah, but
right?
let's do something different.
Yeah. I think that's the natural evolution of thinking about a problem.
Yeah.
Right? Because when you first started it, you're looking very narrowly at the problem, and as you start addressing it, just by nature, the window starts getting wider and wider around what factors into that problem, right? And as you start to get further out, you come into some really impactful, really creative solutions. And I think that we're just early in that process, right? And being here in Houston and participating in these conversations, and to your point, taking the invitations to speak, taking the invitations to be on these types of podcasts and other presentations, and educating anyone who wants to listen about this, right? We feel like we're in our own small way contributing to this and moving this forward in a small way.
One of the very first openers we used to have in the earliest form of our pitch deck, which I hope will never again see the light of day.
No, very deep in the ground.
Yeah, exactly. We usually start by, materials make up everything. And it's such a platitude, right? Like everything is made of something is another one. But it's so true, right? I mean, like you need to look at the entire upstream and downstream of your product to understand what it's made of. And then when you can no longer use this product, what it's made of, where does that go, right? What happens to it? And it all comes down to the materials of construction.
20 years ago, the companies were not tracking their supply chains. They weren't like public companies weren't obligated to report on their supply chains. No one was looking at, the state of labor at your supplier's mine in, an unknown country. And today there are reporting obligations around that. And I think that one way that government at large, not just Houston or private actors, but like government at large could help encourage some of this transition is to require more disclosure and more reporting, and maybe put some tighter guidelines around that reporting, to get that information out there to the public so the public can make an informed choice when they're making purchases, right? Because we know that demand drives, but also so that companies are thinking about this and are factoring it into their decision making in a way that they really just aren't today.
Absolutely. All right. So one of my favorite questions, talking about technology and innovation, can cover a really, really broad broad area. The sky is the limit. One what prehistoric or extinct flora or fauna would you bring back if you could? There's a story behind this and why we asked this, but curious because I think you guys did some research. I think you've taken our homework to heart.
I did.
Oh,
I
yes,
loved the question. Yeah.
Spent a lot of time on this.
Do you want to go first?
Well, just because we were talking about this morning before we started the podcast, and it's really interesting because the choices that we made, I think, are directly, like, you can draw a direct connection to why we are so passionate about Wootz from our own perspective.
Mm-hmm.
So for me in particular, the one that I really like is passenger pigeons.
Mm-mm.
So super mundane, but in the 1860s, here in the United States, there were billions of them. Billions of them. They would darken the sky, right? And by 1914, there were no more. The last one died in a zoo. And over the course of about 4 decades, it went from billions to zero. And what I really love about this is I think that technology follows the same trajectory, right? It goes from ubiquitous to extinct over decades. For example, I was talking to my dad about fax machines and how prevalent this was in his prime working years, and how today, I mean, God forbid you ask me to fax something, it would take me a whole day to find a fax machine, right? And I love this because I think it goes to show that change is happening on real increasingly tight time scales, which is both exciting and concerning, depending on the lens through which you're looking.
I love the idea of the passenger pigeons too, because every time I've read a description, it sounded like it was something beautiful that we also unfortunately removed from the world. And it would be fantastic to bring that back. But it is that there is that evolutionary nature of technology where things do get wiped out, but we have the opportunity to roll it back.
We do.
Yes.
That's kind of what makes it interesting.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I'm wrong.
I fascinated by the flora side, primarily, Silphium would be my pick. It's a type of flower that went extinct during the Roman Empire, but back in the day, it was used to treat all kinds of illnesses. And I know there's a lot of other plants that fit into that category, but think for a moment, this one was talked about by the Romans as being worth its weight in gold. It was printed on currency, right? Emperor Nero was proud to have allegedly been fed the last stalk of Silphium. And, 70% of all cancer drugs used today are based in one way, shape, or form on a naturally occurring molecule, because there is no greater creator, right? I mean, we can do combinatorial chemistry ad infinitum. The variety and the complexity of molecules that you find in the natural world is almost endless. So if we could only just, imagine we could bring that back, that such a multifunctional plant back, and take a modern stab at it, what benefits could we get? And also, wouldn't it be nice to have those allegedly yellow colored flowers, gold colored flowers, popping all over the hills of Tuscany?
Hills of Tuscany, hills of Texas.
Hills of Texas.
Although we can't take out the bluebonnets.
You're
right.
You're right.
So
it can't displace bluebonnets.
I love that you mentioned Nero. I love all things old. I was an ancient history and classical civilizations major. I wanted to be Indiana Jones. I love dinosaurs. And like, in a weird way, it's because I truly believe that history repeats itself, and that if we don't learn from what happened, we will do it again. And so let's try to do it better, right? And you see that so much in innovation, right? The difference between invention and innovation, like taking something that you said you came, there were many people before you that helped your company and your technology kind of get to where you are. The important part is like tweaking that and seeing an enormous jump forward in efficiency, in opportunities. And so you have to look back as well, right? That's a really important part. And I don't know oftentimes if we think about that enough, that even if you think about the energy transition, like, this isn't our first transition. It probably won't be our last. This is not a box that we're going to check and be like, oh, we decarbonized, done, right? we need no new technology. No, it has to keep going constantly. And I also love the idea of some of the solutions we probably had before, and we let them go, right? There could be a solution from a plant somewhere that we had that would solve things going forward. And so it's like a weird circular. There we go. Making up the Texan in me makes up words sometimes that aren't real. That what's old is new again.
Mm-hmm.
So I love that idea.
Yeah. So I think we're running low on time, so we need to wrap. What is one thing our audience could do to support you?
How can we help you? Are you looking for staff? Are you looking for funding? Are you looking for partners?
I mean, all of the above. If I had an infinite wish list, those would all be in like the top 10 for sure. We are going to be raising our Series A in Q2 of this year, so right around the corner. So we are definitely looking for investors who are interested in supporting this change and this material innovation that we are trying to bring to market. Mm-hmm. But beyond that, once we raise our Series A, we will also be hiring. We have a very small team now, and we were joking this morning with you guys that really what we need right now is to clone ourselves for $0 because we have way more work than we could ever possibly do with the size team that we have today. So, one of the things is if you're interested in this space, if you're interested in carbon nanotubes, if you want to be part of something really cool, we're going to be hiring in the near future, and we would love to hear from people because we're a little bit daunted by the prospect of having to hire all these incredible people on the time frame that we set for ourselves.
So how can investors or potential employees find you?
So we obviously have a webpage. It's wootsnano.com. We are also on LinkedIn. You can contact myself, Olivia SB Huntington, Amram Bengio, or Alex Marks. We also have, if you email info@wootsnano.com, one of us will also get back to you. Also, we are at Greentown Labs pretty frequently. We are at the ION pretty frequently. We are also at Rice pretty frequently. So you can just pull us aside and say hi.
Awesome.
Also, important question that I didn't ask. Wootz, where did the name come from?
This is going to get your material science nerd going, Jason. It's a bit of a homage to an ancient form of steel. I don't know if you've ever heard of Damascus steel. People who've watched Game of Thrones will, think of Valyrian steel. But 500 to 600 years before Damascus steel even came about, there was another form of crucible steel that was made in the Far East in modern day Sri Lanka. And the British were the ones who mistranslated, it was originally called wuku, and mistranslated it to Wootz. Now, Wootz steel is a bit of a modern mystery, almost like the kind of like pyramids, because while modern metallurgists understand how, during the Islamic Caliphate, Damascus steel was formed, we still don't have the full picture or understanding of how, using contemporary technology, they were able to create Wootz steel. And so it's this, steel is an alloying of iron and carbon done in a very specific, obviously very specific way. And they were able to achieve, super material properties using ancient technology.
So a little bit of magic there. And I think we have really embraced that. So we like to think of ourselves as being the combination of expertise, state-of-the-art equipment, and magic.
Mm-hmm.
I love magic. I love ancient conspiracy theories that may involve aliens,
That's right.
which is going to be another podcast.
The aliens taught us
Ancient
how to make
mysteries
boots.
with
Yeah.
Lara.
There you go.
Love it. Okay.
Awesome.
Thank you so much.